All right, the desperately sad news broke this morning. The passing of Gianluca Vialli, a Chelsea legend, as we probably know him at this side of the water, passed away at the age of just 58, having lived with pancreatic cancer since 2018. Martin Lipton of The Sun, football writer with The Sun, covered London football, beat during the 90s and beyond, joins us now. Martin, thanks a million for taking the call, first of all.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a sad day indeed.
Yeah, sad day. And you get to reflect on him as a person and a player, as many have been doing over the course of the day, and I'm sure it'll continue over the next few days as well. But a force of nature and as a player and a personality is the thing that's clearly emerging.
He was very much so. The thing about Gianluca is that he came from a very different background to the vast majority of footballers. I mean, most of them are street footballers, many of them escaping from poverty. And of course, he came from an extremely wealthy background. He lived in this huge castle, which is about 700 years of history behind it, in Cremona. So he was much more privileged than most of his teammates, and yet that bred in him a desire, a desperation, actually, a yearning to prove that he was as committed and deserving of playing as any of those. And he did that. He was a real workaholic. On and off the pitch. And I think he took that into his management career as well, and perhaps too much. He took the pressure on himself to a huge degree, and you could see it having a physical effect on him. So when he took over at Chelsea, everything was light, and the smiles were there. And by the end of a 3-year term, which was actually pretty successful, 5 trophies and all 3 major trophies in terms of the League Cup, the FA Cup and the Cup Winners' Cup, you could see he was suffering under that weight of pressure and expectation.
In terms of his arrival into England, particularly early on, like he was one of the vanguard almost of European footballers, wasn't he? Who there were others who had come before, maybe in some respects felt almost like we might view an MLS transfer now, that maybe they were coming towards the tail end of their careers. He had won a Champions League, I think, with Juventus just before he arrived.
There have been a couple before you would say were still in their prime. You could look at Bergkamp or Klinsmann. But the arrival of Vialli at Chelsea was an absolute game changer in many ways. It was a symbol and signal of Chelsea's determination to change their status from probably the 3rd club in London at the time to be number 1. And this was, remember, predating the Abramovich era by 7 years. It was quite a long time before. And he came in to play for Gullit. They had Leboeuf and Di Matteo, and then Zola joined as well. And suddenly Chelsea were transformed into this team of all the talents. And Vialli was very much at the vanguard of that. It was a real shock when he joined.
How much, in terms of the style of play, Martin, like his, strong player, good in the air, obviously a goal scorer, but much more than that as well. How much was he the glue for that Chelsea team? And talk to us a little bit about his style of play at that time.
Well, to be fair, initially he really wasn't. He was signed as the starting striker, and then Zola joined relatively soon the next season. And Vialli found himself on the bench for quite a lot of that period because Gullit went with Hughes and Zola up front. He made a few cameo appearances. He scored goals. I mean, there was one FA Cup tie against Liverpool when they won 4-2 from 2-0 down, and then the following season I was up in the Arctic Circle in Tromsø. Where nobody, it seemed, could stay on their feet except Gianluca Vialli, who slalomed through the Tromsø defence for 1 goal and was absolutely brilliant. But he struggled to be as impactful a player as he wanted to be. And yet he had with him such a bearing, such a sense of poise and purpose that he was perhaps more of a talisman than he realised himself.
Yeah, and he obviously was it Gullit that brought him in?
It was Gullit brought him in, yeah, because Gullit had taken over from Hoddle that summer. Hoddle went from Chelsea to England, and Gullit stepped up as manager. And they obviously had respect for each other as players and have played against each other in Italy. But their relationship, I think it's fair to say, became somewhat strained relatively quickly.
What was that in relation to the very obvious thing that he wasn't getting a game, Martin, in your view, or was there something else?
That. And also I think that they discovered they didn't have the same approach to life. It's as simple as that. I mean, they both have respect for each other as players, but perhaps there was the personal element wasn't there. A lot of those Chelsea players found or felt that Gullit was too aloof for them, that he didn't speak to players who weren't in the team, and there's one fairly well-known player who got into a lot of trouble because he told me this, and I wrote it, and I was a bit surprised when I wrote it. And this player, he's in the media now, he's well known. He would tell you he didn't feel wanted at all and felt that he was alienated. And this wasn't Vialli, but it was indicative of that particular period under Hullet. I think Hullet changes the manager and changes the person as well since. But at the time, sometimes players and personalities don't mesh.
Like, it was around the time as well that the English game was changing as well, wasn't it, for the better ultimately? I mean, there was the Arsene Wenger past 2 years, or whatever way you want to look at it. The attitude to nutrition and training and to being a professional footballer was very much changing around that time. What did he bring to Chelsea in that regard, if anything, from your recollection?
He bought a lot of fags.
Really?
No doubt about that.
Really?
I think he was much more of the Italian model. I remember David Platt telling me that when he joined from Arsenal from Juventus, he couldn't believe that he didn't have an individual plan at Arsenal, whereas everyone at Juventus had even then they were tagged into computers and given us a card telling them what their exercises were. And English football now, every player has got an individual program. They're all monitored up. This was the very beginning of that. And Vialli brought that Italian mindset. He'd been, under Lippi at Juventus. He'd been part of a very more professional in every sense setup, and he wanted to introduce that to English football at Chelsea.
And like to smoke?
He did indeed. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that he grew up in that environment. He never hid the fact that he smoked cigarettes, and quite a lot of them. A lot of the Italian players do. I mean, look at Ancelotti. He can't stop smoking. It seems to be a continental thing more than a British thing, or at least was. Players did smoke and still do, but I think fewer do now.
Gentleman goal scorer was, I saw him described with one source earlier. It was a very moving tribute from Graham Souness on Sky earlier as well, who said he was a gorgeous soul and wanted to talk much more about him sort of off the pitch than his attributes as a player necessarily. What are your recollections of Martin at that time? I mean, I don't know, was he, in terms of press conferences or post-match interviews and stuff, what was your sense or view of him at that time?
I think what came across straight away was his empathy and warmth as a human being. He always had that. He listened to people. He had this slightly laconic way of speaking. He was reluctant to give out too many hostages to fortune. He thought through every word, but it also meant that he meant every word. So if he was critical of somebody, it was because he meant it. He really had thought about it and felt this was the time. But he didn't like to do that. He wanted to be positive about other people. He felt he had a nurturing role, and he also never forgot a face. I remember once after he left Chelsea a few years, I was at Cardiff for a cup final, so it would have been early 2000s, and this bloke wearing a beanie hat came up to me and said, "Why are you ignoring me?" And I just said, "It's you." I didn't realise it was you because he was hidden away. He wasn't it wasn't look at me. He was just. And that was it. He had that warmth about him that he wanted to chat to people he recognised and people he liked. And if he liked you, if he recognised you, he would come and instigate conversations. Now, there aren't that many football people who do that. They're quite happy to stay in their little group and not go outside it. And Luca was a very different person. He was empathetic, warm, a gentleman. Graham Souness is right in that. He was a genuinely lovely man.
And ended his playing days at Chelsea as well. Obviously, you touched on the manager piece as well. What are your recollections about at the end of his days as a Chelsea player, Martin? I know obviously it was, I'll use the word complicated, maybe there are other words, complicated by the fact that he was obviously now starting to progress a different path. Yeah,
he was player manager, and it became fairly clear to him, I think, quite early that you couldn't combine the two, that he had to be one or the other, and he could see the writing on the wall for his playing days. So he was 33, 34 by now, that he was going to become manager. And he did that. And as I said, successful indeed. They won the League Cup, which was a bit of a bounce when he first came over. But the following year, they won the Cup Winners' Cup. And then in 2000, the last Wembley FA Cup final, they beat Aston Villa. Di Matteo scoring the goal in 2000. He won the Charity Shield at the start of the next season. Everyone, this is a chance of a title charge. And then 5 games later, he was sacked.
Was he hoist by his own petard in some regards, in the sense that they'd obviously just won a trophy. He'd won loads of trophies. A run of Did you say they hadn't won any game in the 5 matches?
Yeah, it had a poor start to the season, which was a bit of a surprise because they spent some money. But no one saw the sacking coming. He didn't see the sacking coming. As he admitted, he thought he was going to be given a pay rise. He ended up getting the sack. But then that's Chelsea, and that was Ken Bates, and that was Colin Hutchison, and they made a decision that it was time to move on. There was a little bit of, and there always is, there's always be friction in a dressing room. Nothing can ever be smooth, and people were maybe being a bit critical of him, and he bit back at that. That's just what happens in football, isn't it? We shouldn't be surprised by that. The reverence that the Chelsea fans had, though, didn't go away. They always had a soft spot for him, and rightly so. Yeah. And many of them look back with genuine fondness, and they should do, over what he brought to the club.
He can easily feel hard done by. I mean, you can easily feel hard done by. That's the sort of thing that I think a lot of managers, particularly in the early parts of your career, and we see a lot of examples of it now, where you've done quite well, and then suddenly you, as you would view it, I think unfairly, get the sack. The one thing that I was, because I'd totally forgotten about it, like majorly surprised about looking back at his career this morning, was just how it and you touched on it earlier, he had this great success. He won 5 trophies at Chelsea. He's still the second most winning manager at Chelsea behind Jose. An incredible run over a very short period of time. Gets picked up by Watford for a year afterwards and never becomes full manager again.
No, that was the end of his managerial career. He decided that he didn't need it anymore. I think the pressure did hurt him, and I think he felt wounded by the end at Watford. It ended up with quite a messy contractual dispute. So he went into TV punditry, into his various business interests as well. And of course, at the end of his career, in the last few years, he'd been working with his great friend from back when they joined when they were at Sampdoria together. So 40-year friendship with Roberto Mancini at Italy. And when Italy beat England to win the Euros last year on the Wembley site, if not the same pitch, where they shared the disappointment and frustration and angst of losing the European Cup final to Barcelona 30 years earlier, they together shared that moment of joy and glory against England by lifting the trophy on penalties.
Is it too far a stretch in your opinion now, Martin, just reading between the lines of a lot of stuff that you've said there about his caring for the players, almost his nurturing, I think was the word you used, of the players at that time, that maybe he was a little bit ahead of the game, that the game wasn't ready necessarily as it is now? I think it's much more of a player-led environment now, football.
I think that's a fair argument, actually, that he would have perhaps had a longer managerial career if he'd been 10 years younger. In that there was still a yearning for many clubs and boards for a sort of dressing room dictator. Now, they still exist in some places, but far fewer. There's a couple of obvious examples that we've seen in the Premier League at the moment and in recent years. But there's a lot more of that empathetic manager. And you look at someone, the current inhabitant at Chelsea. We don't know how long that will last for, obviously, but Graham Potter. You can see him as being in the Vialli mould as a manager. Eddie Howe's done the same sort of thing at Newcastle. There's a lot more of that understanding of the modern player rather than trying to browbeat players, as was the case and was accepted as the norm for many, many years.
What was the nature of his... There was a falling out with Zola and Deschamps and a couple of other senior players, if I'm right. Was that tactics?
I mean, I said you always get that, don't you? Unfortunately, that great players clash, great personalities clash. I think those kisser made up time subsequently. It just didn't. There was a sense of, I think, within the squad that there was a degree of drift and inertia, and they didn't think there was things going forward. And deputations were made to the board, and in came Claudio Ranieri.
Yeah, well, as you say, he made an incredible mark on not just Chelsea, but I think on English football, and not to mention his time in Italy, which we will discuss in a little bit. But Martin, appreciate the time today. Thanks a million for taking the call.
No worries. Thanks a lot.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky. Get more of the sports you love on Sports Extra with BT Sport and Premier Sports.
This is News Talk.
Very welcome back to Off the Ball. It's Adrian with you until 10, and if you're with us before the break, we've been discussing the sad passing of Gianluca Vialli this morning. If you're just coming out of your office this evening, the news that he passed away earlier at the age of just 58, having lived with pancreatic cancer since 2018. We were getting the English angle a little bit earlier on. We wanted to get the view from Italy as well, so delighted to say a regular contributor on all things Italy, Paddy Agnew, joins us on the line now. Evening, Paddy.
Hi, good evening, Adrian.
sad news, obviously, this morning. How has it been reacted to so far in his home country?
Well, it's huge news, Adrian, because Vialli, particularly after Italy's triumph last year or 2 years ago, it is now in the European Championships in England, is something of a national hero, and he's a national hero because not only was he a fantastic footballer and a fantastic football manager, but above all because he made a very public thing of his fight against pancreatic cancer. And, a lot of people who probably wouldn't necessarily have paid an awful lot of attention to him or to football became aware of him because he was playing a prominent role in Italy's terrific European Championship win in the formation of that side and the preparation of that side. And he was doing all of that while suffering from pancreatic cancer and talking about it as well. He did a lot of talking about cancer and work for cancer research. So, he's a bit of a national hero.
Can you take us back to the start a little bit, Paddy, if you will, about his upbringing and his entry into the game? A pretty untypical path, I might say, into football.
Yeah, he didn't start off, obviously at the top of the game, but he worked his way up, and his first big club was Cremona, wasn't it? And he moved then on from Cremona to Sampdoria. And he's obviously much remembered because of the contribution he made to that Sampdoria side, and because that's the last time, 1991, that a small team, a so-called provincial team, won the Italian title. If you look at it since then, basically only 3 clubs have won it. Inter Milan, AC Milan, and Juventus, and once or twice in Rome and Lazio. But he's very well remembered for that. And then, of course, he moved on from there, as you know, to Juventus, won a lot of things with Juventus, went to England, became an English gentleman, and won a lot with Chelsea.
I think people certainly of my generation, Paddy, maybe less so the younger cohort, but have been very familiar with him in his days, obviously at Sampdoria, particularly, and into Juventus. And reading today about the former Sampdoria owner Paolo Mantovani, how he had recognised that even at that early stage, that bond between himself and Mancini, Roberto Mancini, was something special. Obviously, we got to know about it much more. You've already alluded to it in recent years, but that bond between the two, even as players, was becoming very obvious and was key in a lot of respects to that Serie A success for Sampdoria. Yeah,
it was at the heart of it. But yeah, I would say also it was the heart of Italy's win in England last 2 years ago. I mean, the image of Vialli that has been most used in the Italian media and online today is not of Vialli, the player with Juventus, Chelsea or Sampdoria, but of Vialli embracing Mancini after they won the penalty shootout against England at Wembley in the Euro 20 final. And what was strange about that for Italians was that they'd been used to the terrible twins, as they were called, Vialli and Mancini, as players. And people were utterly delighted the same terrible twins were able to bring their talents together to produce a European Championship winning team.
Talk to us a little bit, if you will, about Vialli as a player, and he, on the face of it, certainly at a national level, wasn't the prolific goal scorer of a Baggio or one of these, but what role he played for Italy, what role he played for Juventus, how that developed over his career.
Well, I think Vialli would be called, very much a modern player in the sense that the characteristic about him that mattered most was he was a very determined guy. And I mean, I remember talking to him on the eve of Italy's 1990 semi-final against Argentina and Naples, a game that Italy lost and kept them out of the final. But I remember Vialli, had been kept out of that team at that time by a guy called Schillaci, who the Irish will remember well. And he was a bit pissed off, and he said, "It's time now for guys with balls to be playing, and I should be in the team," basically. because he was that type of player, very, very strong physically, good in the air, but a huge work rate. He started off as with Cremona as a winger, but he soon became a sort of central target man. But a lot more than that.
Would you have had many dealings with him, Paddy, over the years?
Yeah, well, I've won not particularly exciting dealing with him, but it struck me as the way he behaved. I went up to Juventus. So in those days, I was doing TV interviews for ESPN and people, and we had requested to do an interview with Vialli, and we went up to Turin, and the team was training in those days at the old Stadio Comunale, and Vialli came out after training and after he got changed. He came out and said, "Sorry, I'm not going to do the interview." And I said, "Geez, we've come all this way to do an interview with you. Can you not do it? Can you not do anything about it?" And he said, "I said," and he said, "No, it's not that the club won't let me do it. It's that I don't want to do it. I've done too much talking. Thanks very much. Nice to meet you." And the only thing I remember about that was that, but that happens all the time to guys like me when you're taking a TV crew around to clubs, or it was in those days. I don't think you do it so much now, but it can happen easily. But normally the player slips out the back door, goes to the car park and gets into his car and drives off. And Vialli came out of his way to apologise.
Yeah, mark of the man. Certainly when you listen to I don't know what's been said about him in Italian media today, Paddy, and you might give us a sense of that, but certainly here, particularly an interview with Graham Souness on Sky, but earlier on he was very emotional while talking about him, and certainly a gorgeous spirit, I think, was how he described him. What's been the standout reactions? What's been the general reaction there on Italian media?
I think it's somebody like Marco Tardelli and many others, though, use the same phrase. A leader, a very generous leader, a generous player, a leader on and off the field, because the last chapter in his life, his battle against pancreatic cancer, left a very strong impression on people.
A serial winner is the one thing when you look at his career. I mean, no coincidence that it just everywhere he went. I mean, the clubs that you listed off.
Yeah. No, he picked up titles and cups. He started off winning cups with Sampdoria, and he never stopped, really.
Yeah.
His biggest disappointment, I think, was with Sampdoria. When they lost the 1992 then Champions Cup to Barcelona in Wembley. That was possibly his biggest disappointment. And when 4 years later Juventus got to the Champions League final in Rome against Ajax, and it's something I'd forgotten, but I was just looking reminded of it today. He refused to take one of the penalty kicks. Marcello Lippi was amazed. Like he wasn't a guy, Vialli, who was frightened of anything or timid in any shape or form. But what he said was, "Look, I missed a penalty in the Turin. I missed a penalty. Didn't miss a penalty. I missed a couple of great chances in our game against Barcelona, our final against Barcelona 4 years ago. And I don't want you remembered by Italian fans as the guy who fluffed it in 2 successive Champions League finals, and so he wouldn't take his kick in the penalty kick out, and not that it mattered because Juventus won anyway. But at that time, what he was thinking was that was June or May of 1996, and he knew that he was moving on to English football and he was moving on to Chelsea.
Yeah, some of the best leaders are more aware of their shortcomings, isn't that that's what they say, that sometimes that's the best leadership. What, just in terms of, when that move that you speak about, the Juventus to Chelsea move, we've been speaking about him sort of all day as kind of leading that vanguard of European footballers who come into English football at that time. Was that I don't know, against the wishes of Juve, but did Juve want to keep him at that stage?
No, I think, Juve and Marcello Lippi in particular have a policy with a lot of players whereby they let them go pretty quickly on a lot of the good players because they just think all the time that players need new stimulus. So I think, and they also felt Vialli was not, correct me, was he 32 when he went to
yeah, he would have been about that.
Chelsea?
Yeah.
And you know, the Juventus would have felt, well, if somebody's willing to give us good money for him, we'll take it, because you know, there are not that many seasons left at this level for him.
Yeah, and then we all know what he went to go on to achieve there. We've discussed the Chelsea thing in a bit of detail earlier, but the one thing that I was slightly surprised about was the how successful he was as a manager at Chelsea, brief spell at Watford, and then never manages again. Was there any ever sense that you know, obviously he'd settled in London, as you say, but was there any sense that he might go back to Italy and take a gig there?
Every time a major club had, there was a decade when every time a major club sacked a coach and you were looking for a quick replacement, Vialli's name would often come up, would be in the list, but it never happened actually.
Yeah,
I was always surprised by that, but I would presume that the Italian football world felt that he'd been too long out of Italian club football, and that. He'd become too anglicised, and you know, just wasn't in contact anymore, and he wouldn't be a good bet.
Yeah, we were talking to Martin Lipton earlier. Maybe the sense that he was kind of almost ahead of his time as a manager, in that he was very player focused, like he was a real players manager almost, in a way that maybe at that time the world wasn't quite ready for.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I remember reading a piece by him in Gazzetta dello Sport, where he used to write a column in it was around 2005, 2006. And he was talking about Rafa Benitez and Jose Mourinho. And he was talking about how the English game had changed even since he'd left it, which wasn't that long before then. And he was saying one thing that's happening here is you've got a lot of managers who think a lot about their players, what the players' needs are, and how much you need to get inside their heads and help them psychologically, and that was obviously something that he had tried to practice as a coach himself.
Yeah, sad day for Italian football, for European football. Paddy, thanks a million for jumping on the line.
Okay, thank you.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky, proud partner and supporter of the Republic of Ireland women's national football team.
This is News Talk.